Yeah, sure. Here are 5 relatively uncontested things that most mainstream biblical scholars believe. I would estimate upwards of 90% of them believe that your casual reader of the Bible might not necessarily believe. Number 1, the composition of the Pentateuch. A casual reader of the Bible might assume that the first 5 books of the Bible, also called the Pentateuch, were written by Moses, as has been held by long tradition. But biblical scholars in general believe that the first 5 books of the Bible were edited together out of at least 3 originally independent sources, composed in very different times and very different places by very different people with different ideological and theological agendas. And this is the best explanation for the tensions and contradictions that we find all throughout the Pentateuch. Biblical scholars disagree on how best to characterize these various sources, when they were written, and how they were edited together, but they absolutely do not disagree that these sources exist and they compose the Pentateuch that we have today. Number 2, the Deuteronomistic history. A casual reader of the Bible might assume that Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings were composed by a variety of historians down through the centuries whose primary purpose was the recording of history and the various acts of God contained therein. But most biblical scholars today believe that this collection of texts called the Deuteronomistic history reached its final form in the middle of the 6th century BCE in the midst of exile and doesn't really serve any historical purposes at all, but was rather composed for apologetic purposes to help explain and justify why it is that the people of Israel ended up in captivity in Babylon. Number 3, the historicity of ancient Israel. A casual reader of the Bible might assume that the first several books of the Bible are primarily history with a little bit of legend or hyperbole thrown in here and there. But biblical scholars in general don't believe that the balance between legend and history really tips in the favor of history until the 9th century BCE in the Omride dynasty in northern Israel. It's around this time that we get significant extra-biblical epigraphic and archaeological evidence that confirms not only the broad contours of many of these biblical narratives, but also some of their very specific historical claims. Now, the 9th century BC is still a very long time ago, but this means that Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuels, and the first 15 chapters of 1st Kings are primarily legendary or mythic and not so much history. Number 4, the historicity of the Exodus and the conquest of Canaan. A casual reader of the Bible might assume that these events are more or less historical. But biblical scholars in general don't believe that either of these events happened in a form that even roughly corresponds to the way that they are described in the biblical narrative. Both of these events are national in scope, and they would certainly leave behind particular forms of evidence that we would be able to detect today, and that evidence simply does not exist. Moreover, there are internal tensions in multiple traditions within the biblical text itself that make it difficult for us to understand what exactly the text is trying to get at as far as historical claims are concerned. Number 5, the emergence of Israel in the land of Canaan. A casual reader of the Bible might assume on the basis of the Exodus and conquest narratives that the people of Israel originated from outside the land of Canaan and are ethnically distinct from the Canaanites that they come to displace. But most biblical scholars today believe that the Israelites are largely Canaanite as far as ethnicity is concerned, and they only differentiated themselves along religious lines from their Canaanite neighbors over the course of a number of centuries.